So I think we're going to get started now. Thanks everyone for making it to the last session. I think we've spent a lot of time, and it's very easy in the DeFi community to talk about all of the very interesting like computer science problems and see this almost from a very academic angle. And so what we're really going to try and do in this talk is to try and give you, and all of us really, and remind ourselves of some of the real world context around DeFi and what it is that we're trying to build. So we've got here Rune, who's the founder of Maker. We've got Gonzalo, who's an independent basically, and
I work for JP Morgan actually. I just don't want to put it down.
You're right. And Mariano, who's the community lead for Maker in Argentina. So it's going to be a relatively kind of Latin America centric deep dive on what it means to be in Argentina and some of these other countries where you have 40% inflation, and we've had something like 20% for the last 10 years. What does that actually mean in practice for the average Argentine or Venezuelan, if you can speak to that, around how you guys, what kind of financial infrastructure is available? What is different compared to the UK or the US or most European countries that we take for granted, that you just don't have in these countries? And practically, like, how do you store value?
Okay, maybe I'll start on that.
Yeah.
So one thing, one clear consequence of living in Argentina, like the average Argentinian is probably more financially literate than the average inhabitant of any first world country, basically because you're dealing with this stuff on a daily basis. So in practical terms, prices rise continuously, and like 40% every year is a fairly reasonable estimate for this year, meaning if you travel quite a bit, it's hard to keep up of whether the price of whatever you're buying is right, because it's really a lot bigger than it used to be, but maybe it's fine. And so that is one thing. And for example, if you have a regular job, like where you work for a company, it typically means you get a salary review every 6 months. That is totally standard, where you would get a pay raise in the order of 15–20%, and that's sort of given at every 6 months. And that's a very, like, if you want to hire a developer in Argentina, you have to basically consider that. The good news is, since the peso exchange rate keeps going down, you're not really paying more for that, but you need to adjust the numbers continuously. So there are all these sort of practical annoyances. But of course, there's the other aspect, which is like, how do you save money? No. So maybe. Do you want to pick that up, or I can go?
Maybe to talk about Mariano, that
it's okay.
bond.
I mean, it's a good topic. Saving in Argentina is really, really difficult, and for all the things that you were talking about, prices lead us to practically hate our national currency. Why? Because it doesn't have like any value. As Gonzalo was saying, 40% of the devaluation in what was like a...
It's the projection for this year is like around 40%.
Yeah, 40%. So that's a lot of money that people is losing right now. So, for example, that leads us to this seeking dollar madness in Argentina. Yeah. And obviously, it's not helpful for inflation in the country, right? Much of the prices are like correlated to dollar in Argentina, even though the raw materials of the product doesn't have anything to see with the dollar, right? So it's kind of crazy.
It's certainly an interesting phenomenon. So the practical consequence is, if you store 1 peso in your bank account and you go back a year later and you try to buy something with it, you really have half the money. So people don't really do that because that wouldn't work. And the options that are available, is that what you were going to ask?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask about this bond that you guys were talking about.
Yeah, the LEBACs and LELIQs.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you know, guys, but in Argentina we have like a very weird bond. There are 2 right now, no? LEBACs and LELIQs. And they are paying like 7% monthly rate. So let's start thinking for a moment, 7% monthly rate, right? And these bonds were created by the government in order to capture pesos that are circulated on the street in Argentina, hopefully to lower the inflation. But the thing is that right now those bonds are holding $12 billion in pesos. And central bank needs to pay that interest, needs to pay an interest out of that debt every month. So my question is, what will happen when the central bank won't be able to meet this obligation? And I guess that this is like the almost fertile ground for stable coins, right? Because those pesos, I mean, when are again on the street, they will be looking for dollars, right?
So there's a difference there. You know, the bond at 7% annualized is going to be something like 100% roughly. But if we have a 40% inflation rate, that's a very attractive return. So I guess there's a discount there, which is basically the faith that people have that the government is going to pay back. So you have this sort of counterparty risk there.
And the depreciation of the peso.
And the depreciation
of course,
of the peso,
which is going to
Yeah, but if you're making 100% and you depreciate 40, you've still made 60% now.
Yeah.
And just this kind of ties in very nicely with what you guys are working on. So maybe Rune, you could speak to interest rates and where you guys see those playing in the Maker ecosystem.
Yeah, so so like you were saying, right, an obvious use case already here based on these conditions of high inflation in Argentina is just people adopting something like DAI. Stablecoins basically just, they can get easy exposure to the US dollar. Because right now, basically, what you guys were saying earlier, right, is that everybody saves up in physical US cash, which is then not very sophisticated because you got to like hold it, like some people put it in their safety deposit boxes, right, but in general it's not very convenient. And it's actually a great like use case to just be able to hold that digitally, right, because now you can more safely actually have a large savings account. But then on top of that, a really cool feature that DAI is going to have once we launch this multi-collateral DAI, so the full version of our system, is that just like when you have money in the bank, when you have money holding it in DAI, you will actually get a savings rate. So over time, you'll earn like this, like pretty low, but like a steady return on your DAI. And that actually means it's going to be a very interesting sort of case for decentralized finance specifically here, right? Because this means that now we can actually give people in Argentina access to something that they just haven't had access to at all before, right? Both the digital savings, but also a way to actually earn some return on their capital.
That's true. And let me add something that maybe like paints the whole picture. A couple of years ago in Argentina, we have a personal cap to buy dollars. So that's what's very crazy because obviously when you are putting some caps, you're putting restriction, black markets tend to flourish, right? So in every corner of the country, there were people selling and buying dollars. So having this option as a decentralized manner to have exposure to a dollar, I think that would be one of the greatest things because Argentina, besides all of its problems, it has like a very good infrastructure, right? We have a high internet penetration, we have a high mobile phone use, and I think that is why I consider Argentina one of the very first use cases of decentralized stablecoin. And let me highlight that decentralized stablecoin because, well, as you may know, all these stablecoins that are right now, I always tend to think or wonder why would anybody want to have like a stablecoin that can be like frozen at a distance, right? Maybe if you are part of that system, the system that can froze those funds, it's okay to you. But people that are far away from that system, such as Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, Africa, whatever, I don't think that it could be like a good option, right?
And so I'm guessing you organize meetups or events in Argentina, and if so, I'm wondering what your prototypical person attending is. Is it kind of the same crypto crowd as you would find in here or London, or is it kind of moms and pops? And
what you have in Argentina is like there is new people coming to meetups, right? People that are eager to know more about crypto, but people that are also starting to learn about capital markets and finance. As Gonzalo says, probably the average Argentina knows a lot about inflation. And those are the people that the last meetups are starting to show.
Gonzalo, have you heard about Maker from anyone that's kind of non-crypto?
Well, I would have a hard time answering to that because I'm so into this stuff that I probably wouldn't even notice if I heard about Maker. But Now, something that's interesting sort of ties into the same idea, and I wanted to bring up. So I'm very deeply sort of interested, and I focus very hard on the securities ecosystem. And we saw a great panel earlier, and there's a bunch of people here that are either interested or working on that kind of stuff. And something to keep in mind clearly is that there's a lot of barriers for adoption. There are a lot of regulatory barriers, and there are a lot of UX barriers to the use of all of this sort of fantastic technology that everyone is working on. In my opinion, if you ask the question like, where are people gonna jump through the hoops to use this stuff? Like, and the answer is in emerging countries. I think it's clearly an opportunity for all this stuff. There's people there that are gonna put up with all the complications that exist currently in order to actually get the product. And that is, in my experience, not very apparent to people that are based either in the US or Europe or in basically any mainstream financial hub. Because you take a lot of things for granted that are just not there. So that's just something to keep in mind.
So sometimes I less and less so, but I find it most difficult to actually explain crypto to Americans in the financial world, so financial profession. Because on the one hand, they have grown up with the US dollar and they can't imagine an unstable monetary regime. On the other, they work in finance and they really actually appreciate the complexity and just the amount of connective tissue that exists to kind of make the financial world go round. And so one of my questions for you guys is, maybe not just Argentina, and I know you can speak to Ghana, but what are the friction points? Why have people not, what are you seeing people actually adopt and use today? Is it a lot? Is it not very much? What have been kind of the friction points to getting into that for the average person?
So, are you talking about South America specifically, or you want the Ghana case?
We can talk about Ghana as well.
Yeah, so I have this other interesting story we got about adoption of decentralized technology in emerging markets is Ghana specifically, because what we're seeing in Ghana is this is actually something that's happening in a lot of African countries, but in particular, for some reason, it's very popular in Ghana. And it's basically sort of the idea of a traditional community bank being powered by a new wave of fintech use cases and sort of smartphones and this kind of stuff. It's basically it's like these agents that kind of function as these like traveling bank tellers that go out to villages and then either collect savings or like pay out cash to people that that all has an account with them, and also handle stuff like international or even just like long distance transactions to anyone else in that sort of small fintech banking network. And that actually works really great, and it's pretty widely adopted in Ghana, and it's a big business case that's constantly growing. But it still has a really big pain point, which is just the fact that it relies on banks to provide sort of the underlying infrastructure of money. And those banks really like to give them kind of bad deal, specifically just not giving them any interest rates and just generally just like giving them just like the bare bones service and taking sort of the lion's share of the value for themselves. So there are actually multiple of these platforms that came to us and expressed an interest in using DAI specifically because of the savings rate, right? So specifically because of the same thing I was talking about, where it's also a cool thing in Argentina, you can get access to this, like actually a pretty rich, like a pretty fair interest rate because the system doesn't really take much of a cut. And that specifically for the Ghana case, what that means is that these platforms can monetize by taking a portion of the savings rate rather than pushing these like kind of onerous fees on the end user every time you want to deposit and withdraw. So it's just going to be like a nice upgrade of the system that's already in place there. And at the same time, like a really big leap in adoption for blockchain technology because it's just going to start powering like thousands of people already using these systems.
This is a really cool bottom-up approach, right? Where people is going to use it as an everyday currency.
I think probably the reasons for low adoption is that all the stuff is very new. I mean, you have to actually go and if you want like regular people to use it, well, for starters, you need to make wallets. I mean, whatever doesn't have a wallet already has 2 more steps in adoption than anything else.
You mean like sort of a per currency wallet?
Like you need to make it more straightforward, and there needs to be like a real marketing push. You have to go talk to people and find local partners that are going to sort of push it into. But in my experience, the sort of the product is so compelling that it shouldn't be very hard. You know, you're not going to have to shove it down anyone's throat, because they're going to be very eager to take this kind of thing. They really need it. So yeah, that's my angle, basically.
Another thing that I would like to add regarding adoption is, for example, I guess infrastructure is another important point, right? In Venezuela, there is a country that always comes up when we are talking like use cases of cryptocurrency. Internet has a 60% penetration, right? So there's 40% of the country that doesn't have any internet access. So I think that's another like big important thing to tackle in order to widespread the adoption of crypto.
So even not just internet, but you know, if you have a $20 Android phone, which is what most people in the world have, is there an app that you can download with wallets where you can actually do something like this? And to what extent do we really need laptops to do this?
Definitely anyone with a smartphone can use blockchain technology. And just another example of something we're doing is with this project called Sempo, that actually what they do is they like stand up these mobile money, like feature phone, SMS money systems that then actually draw the money, like draw their value from the DAI they hold. But very often, I mean, I think in general, to make adoption easier, it's about like creating centralized interfaces around sort of the pool of decentralized money. And yeah, just like sort of combine the ease of use of a regular, familiar use case or like usage method with the efficiency and sort of the better economics of a decentralized backend.
So what do you guys see as the real friction points here? You know, DAI has been, the real friction points is more around education or something else? Trust?
I would say in the curve of adoption of any product, education is like one of the first steps, right? And I guess that, according to my point of view, we are just like passing through that step, education. So that's why I think the educational initiatives around cryptocurrency in emerging markets are like the best thing to do right now.
Maybe if we,
Yeah, no, I honestly, I think most of the technology is very new and there are very few products. I mean, DAI has only been out for, what, less than a year. I mean, it's really, in practical terms, very new. But yeah, I mean, the technology is there. You really need to basically push it out there.
do you come across people who are actually using this stuff, aside from Bitcoin as a store of value, but anyone using a piece of decentralized financial infrastructure today in the wild?
Someone's waving their hand. Who is it?
Yeah, we have someone there.
He's using it.
We have a customer completely paying only in that.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, well, a lot of people also, yeah, in practical terms, a lot of people get paid in, I mean, Argentina, people that work as developers in this ecosystem, they get paid in cryptocurrency from companies that are abroad. And that happens, and I'm guessing, I'm going to assume that Maker pays in DAI, but I don't know. You don't have to answer that, actually.
Yeah, or MKR.
Yeah.
Great, and so one of the things that really sticks out for me, and something actually that Steve Becker, your head of risk at Maker, brought up last week, was just this enormous social responsibility that comes with building financial infrastructure that people are going to use not for speculation, but for storing value. And I think that there's about 70 active stablecoin projects out there today. Some of these mechanisms and pegs are going to break. And so how do you guys think about and position and communicate around this kind of particular subject? Do you hedge out and sort of tell people, would you advise somebody to go and hold all of their pesos and DAI, for example, or to kind of take caution? Do you see this today as something that should be used for speculation and is still thought of as a kind of testing environment? Or do you see it as fully baked out and would almost, not advise, but would feel comfortable telling your mother somewhere in one of these countries, actually putting all of her savings in DAI?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend someone betting everything on single collateral DAI, for instance, right? Because creating real stability and like real certainty of value is, the best you can do is really diversification, right? And that's really what you rely on when, in a regular bank, basically, and sort of entanglement between the various financial systems. So that's why it's so critical that multi-collateral DAI has to be launched, security tokens and just like diversified sources of collateral has to be made available. And then at that point, I think actually pretty quickly, it'll get to a point where you can at least say, you can at least give people, they can basically have a direct look and see, these are the assets. This is what you're essentially buying, right? Like, this is the value you're getting. And then, depending on what your current options are, then you can sort of, I would argue that there are some places where very quickly, once you just have some semblance of like diversified stability in the collateral portfolio of DAI, it actually gets better than like hyperinflating currency or something like that, right? But even so, I think actually you should never put all your eggs in one basket, right? So DAI is just always going to be a nice source of like low risk diversification where you can put some of your savings, right? And then also has other features like interest rate and ability to send and so on. Yeah.
What are the on and off ramps that you guys are either seeing happen or hoping will happen in places like Latin America for DAI?
Yeah, we cannot right now tell that because we are working on that and we have already several agreements already signed. But we are having, I think, like next month, 2 in Argentina, 2 in Chile, 1 in Mexico, and 3 at Colombia.
Can you explain a little bit what they would do?
Yeah, they will be on ramp and off ramp of cash to DAI.
So this is kind of the idea that I can today walk up in the street to somebody and give them pesos for dollars, and I'd be able to do something like that for DAI?
Yeah.
Okay.
And since I'm independent and I can say whatever I want, Argentina has a huge black market where you can buy, it's extremely common, it's what people use to buy US dollars, usually for savings, because, well, we didn't really go into this, but the average Argentinian that stashes US dollars under his mattress to save money, he gets them from a guy, basically. It's very normal. When you say black market, it sounds very shady, but it's really not like that. It's like fancy people in suits. So a lot of those operators,
are they in the
that is
street?
totally straightforward. Like, it's totally normal. Everyone has it, and
peer-to-peer.
It's not a fishy thing. It's just off the books.
Yeah, but it's a guy standing in the street, like, selling dollars?
Well, if you go to the right street, there's literally guys yelling change.
Okay.
But
Mostly on Telegram, people.
Yeah. No, but and then a lot of those historical operators that would trade pesos for US dollars, they did basically cryptocurrency, so Bitcoin, basically. And the trick being that once you have Bitcoin, then you can very easily sort of move into anything else. But if I were a large corporation with serious investors, I wouldn't have a network of black market operators working for me. So thankfully, I can say these things.
I want to leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience. We can't really see anything, but I'm guessing there's someone with a mic.
So you spoke a little bit about how useful DAI could be to help people in Argentina and other EM nations to get dollar exposure, but we didn't talk about how they can actually go from pesos to DAI. What's that workflow look like today?
Today, that what we were talking about on ramp and off ramps, today is at, well, as Gonzalo says, in black market or peer-to-peer market, okay? And as I was saying, we are having a total of 2 in Argentina. We are implementing in exchanges. I guess it was like around 8 in the whole continent, and those will be like the first way to on-ramp and off-ramp DAI from pesos in Argentina or whatever the national currency is in the country.
Or in more practical terms, you basically go and buy Bitcoin from a guy and then transfer that into an exchange and then do your thing, basically. That's the most straightforward way that I would recommend to someone that wants to get DAI if he has pesos. I'm not even sure who I'm talking to anymore, but it's very blinding here.
Yeah.
Any other questions? There we go.
Hi. So you're saying that someone would want to have DAI to have dollar exposure, so that I guess that assumes that you couldn't get direct access to dollars. Could you give us a few scenarios where this is really likely to happen at a generalized scale?
I couldn't hear the last part, actually.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that?
Sorry. So I'm saying, so you're getting DAI to get dollar exposure, right? That assumes that you couldn't get dollars, so that you're getting DAI instead. Could you give us a few scenarios where this happens? scenario where you see that dollars are not available and DAI is the only option?
You mean, I don't think, maybe I misunderstood you, but the assumption being that you can't get US dollars?
Yes.
No, you can definitely get US dollars.
You can.
It's very easy. It's just that having a large wad of US dollars is extremely inconvenient. And people, for example, here's another anecdote. If you want to buy an apartment or something, it's very normal for people to meet up at a bank and exchange significant amounts of cash that they move straight from one person's deposit box to the others in a little room. That is a service. When you get like a fancy bank account, you have a sort of a room service in the bank. So this is fairly, it's not, this what I mean, it's not a shady thing. It's like, it's totally part of the local culture. So the real reason for using a cryptocurrency instead of having dollar bills is that, well, it can't be fake for starters, and it's much easier to basically work with it later.
Yeah, and another thing is the spread. If you buy dollars on a bank account in Argentina, you usually have like a 7% spread. But if you have DAI, if you want to trade it in exchange or whatever, you know that spread is much, much lower than that.
So if DAI becomes the best store of value in those countries, is there a risk that then DAI replaces the national currency?
So, yeah, this is the point of like the separation of money and state as a potential outcome, which I think is pretty worrying to a lot of people. Yeah, if you could talk to that as well.
It's a tough question, mostly because a national currency is also a way to control people, you know. And I'm not seeing that happen anytime soon. Governments won't allow that, let's say, the centralized coin or the centralized stable coin be the national currency. But we are seeing, for example, in Venezuela, that is an informalized, an informal dollarized economy. You know? So kind of that situation is being brought to life by a dollar. Maybe in the future we will see that with a stable coin.
So you were saying that you saw a lot of remittances coming out of Argentina into Venezuela from immigrants. To what extent has I know the government in Venezuela has been trying to crack down on this for obvious reasons, but like to what extent is the government able to do so? And do you think that it would come to that in Argentina if they needed to? Are they able to really suppress conversion to dollars or to DAI or use of cryptocurrencies?
I don't know. But the thing is that, for example, to send money to Venezuela through the banking system is very difficult because you are sending dollars, and the bank at Venezuela is giving people Bolivar according to their exchange rate. It's obviously extremely disadvantaged exchange rate for the people. So that is why a lot of Venezuelans in Argentina are sending cryptocurrencies to the country, because it's, you know, like the whole government captured the banking system in order to play with the exchange rate, and also that is like fueling the whole inflation of Venezuela too.
I can speak to that actually. So, Venezuela.
Could you take the mic?
Yeah. So I'm from Venezuela, and I've been working on some DAI-related projects there. And what we're seeing right now is that the remittances that are being sent in crypto are usually sent in Bitcoin. There is a pretty healthy local Bitcoins marketplace that operates there. We see like sometimes up to like $1 million a day in volume. The government technically could crack down on this, but a lot of the mining operation happening in Venezuela is run by government players, and because of that, they want that off-ramp to exist, even though they're trying to capture the remittances market with this wildly inefficient remittances system that you were just mentioning.
We've got time, I think, for one last question.
Ooh, last question.
No pressure.
Curious if folks in emerging markets are comfortable with self-custody, or if they store funds somewhere else.
When we mean, so the expression in Argentina is poner plata bajo el colchón, meaning putting money under your mattress, and quite literally people do that. So that is, I think, the ultimate definition of self-custody.
Yeah.
But and in practical terms, a lot of people, like if you have significant amounts of money, you would typically wouldn't store them at home. You would store them in a bank. But yeah, this is the kind of hassle that I'm positive people in emerging markets would tolerate, especially since self-custody of a little piece of paper with private keys is much easier than a large, if someone comes into your house and tries to rob you, they're never going to find the little piece of paper. So the actual practical risks of that are much smaller than what they're currently doing. It's the kind of hurdle that I think easily would be jumped over by people in emerging markets. I still don't know.
Cool. Guys, thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating insight. Thank you also to everyone who organized this amazing DeFi event. It's been really fun.
Thank you.